So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream even in the American dream. I have a vision one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
My name is Ray Whiting, and this is the special King Remembering the Legacy. April 2018. This is the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Sitting with me, I have Reverend Ron English, who was the ministerial assistant to Dr. King at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Reverend English, thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here.
Good. I have a few questions I ask. And first and foremost, before I ask the first question, I do have to give respect to you because your fraternity brother, Dr. King,
Yes.
Alpha Phi Alpha,
Yes.
again, I have to give you respect for that. And I want you to elaborate on that as well as far as the fraternity and what have you. You can do that, okay? My first question to you is, when did you first meet Dr. King?
It was almost like the reverse when he met me, because I grew up in Ebenezer. My family goes back at least 2 generations. My grandfather's name is on the cornerstone of the historic church, which is right across the street from what they call the Horizon Sanctuary now. And my father and mother sang in a choir that was directed by Mama King. And therefore, that's where they met each other. And that's where they married. And that's where I was conceived, almost 1 block from the church. Mm-hmm. So it really kind of goes back, in terms of the family English Ebenezer connection was one that extended so far back that it was, in a sense, he met me before I knew him.
Okay. Now, do you recall any of his childhood, anything like that?
No, because at the time that I actually remember knowing him was when he had already accepted the call into ministry. And when he came to Ebenezer during the summer, when he was a student at Crozier Theological Seminary, and would preach during the summer. And we always look forward to that because he always preached much shorter sermons than his daddy, Daddy King. So we look forward to that. I also remember my father had a sister that lived in New York and would often go up to see her. And we hitched a ride with him when he was in seminary at Crozier. And Dr. King always had a kind of a heavy foot on the gas. And during that time, he got a speeding ticket. It was late night, and it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. So he just told us to go on. We had to catch the bus in order to finish the trip into New York. My aunt lived in Harlem. And so that might have been the first time that he was actually arrested for speeding.
Oh my goodness!
Way back in that time. So that kind of goes, far back in terms of actually remembering him from seminary days primarily. Although there were pictures that my mother took of him when he was a kid.
Okay.
And I've used that in a little presentation that I make with children, which I call A King as a Kid, so that they could recognize, like his sister's book tried to portray him, as just an ordinary kid growing up. There was nothing, peculiarly special about him, but he was just an ordinary kid that kids can relate to when they understand that that's where he came from.
Okay. As mentioned, you are a member of the first black fraternity in Alpha Phi Alpha.
Yeah.
You want to elaborate on that?
Yes, I became an Alpha not because of Dr. King, but I became an Alpha. I didn't even know that he was an Alpha at the time that I pledged. There was a director of the Morehouse College Glee Club that had heavily influenced me. His name was Wendell Whalen. And he was an Alpha, and so I had really anticipated going Omega.
Okay.
Because I had a high school friend who was very well known. But I became interested in Alpha by way of Dr. Whalen, and then found out when we were online that there were some distinguished alphas, like Adam Clayton Powell, Martin Luther King, and others, and particularly one of his frat brothers that became very close to him later on during the Birmingham movement was Wyatt T. Walker. So with those kinds of models, and during the pledging period, we had to remember those kind of names,
Oh, okay.
during the marching, and as you know, during the time of trials and tribulations of church pledging.
Right.
So that's when I really became aware that he was Alpha. But he went over in the grad chapter, which means he didn't have as much fun as we did going over in the undergrad chapter.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Okay.
We can't talk about that, but
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Reverend English, of the speeches that he delivered, what stood out the most to you?
It was a mountaintop speech.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that is because I think that while the I Have a Dream speech is much more recorded and much more remembered, that it was at a particular time when he was almost at the zenith of his career. It was a high moment in the civil rights movement. The March on Washington, was really a high zenith moment. But the mountaintop speech was at a point where he was almost at the nadir of his career as far as how he was perceived. It was a low moment in his personal life and in his situation where he had been chastised, criticized to such an extent that it was telling on his face when you look at the pictures of Memphis. You can see the kind of weight that was on him during that particular time. And so for him to speak out of the nadir of his experience was such a powerful moment, was such a powerful message. That's why it stands out to me. And unfortunately, it's not really remembered as much as the mountaintop speech, because in a sense, the mountaintop speech was a safe one. It was one that everybody could applaud and remember, and it's what we most associate with King Day. I'm looking forward to when the mountaintop speech will become associated with King Day in terms of what it meant and how he was going up against the powerful forces of militarism, racism, and poverty, and how that represented his movement in that direction, because he had gone back to Memphis to really deal with the situation that he was called to deal with the sanitation workers strike. And so that really was, and at the time he was considered one of the most unpopular men in America, one of the most hated men in America. And he was having conflict with some of the ones who had supported him, and the president had really kind of turned face on King because of his position on the war in Vietnam. And so it was really a moment where only the heart could bring him to the point of talking as he did about his vision from the mountaintop rather than his dream. And the vision is always more powerful than the dream.
You mentioned earlier about Dr. Wyatt Walker. Please elaborate about Dr. Walker.
Dr. Walker and Dr. King met when they were in seminary. They met, Dr. Walker went to Virginia Union, and Dr. King was at Crozier. And I think they met, according to what Dr. Walker told me, that they met when the presidents of student bodies were assembled together, called together by some national meeting. And that's where they met. And that's when they, learned that they were each other. They were both preachers' kids and that kind of thing, and they both had it. So when Dr. King kept up with what Wyatt, Dr. Walker was doing in Petersburg, Virginia, when he pastored a church there, the oldest church in Petersburg, 17 1897, the Gilfield Baptist Church was established in Petersburg, and that's where Dr. Walker was serving his first pastorate. And he had been very active in the movement against integration of libraries and public facilities and that kind of thing, and going to jail. And so that kind of caught Dr. King's attention, particularly as he was preparing to go into the Birmingham movement. And so he called Wyatt and asked if he would be willing to come and serve as the chief of staff, as his chief of staff, and the master strategist for SCLC. And Dr. Walker did that. Not only was he a master strategist for SCLC, but SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had been primarily operating on the honoraria that Dr. King would receive from speaking. And they didn't have a strong economic foundation, and Wyatt was a genius as far as that kind of organization and building that kind of economic base for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so therefore he was a master strategist of the Birmingham movement, and he was the master strategist of establishing a foundation for SCLC that was very powerful as far as it being able to sustain the organization.
Okay. In 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
He went to Oslo, Norway.
Right.
Talk to me about that.
As I remember, it was a surprise that he had been nominated. And when we got the news that he had been nominated, everybody was hoping that that would happen because he had so richly deserved it. But when the nomination actually happened and took place, and the whole trip to Norway, I was a member of the Glee Club at the time, and they were a part of the Morehouse Glee Club was a part of the organization that was at the airport to wish him off. One of the things that, well, two things that come to mind is how he decided to divide the Nobel Peace Prize money to other civil rights organizations. Well, that was a different way in which his wife really wanted that to happen, because Dr. King never looked for money to be the means by which he would support himself, but how he would support the movement. And so the prize money was symbolic in terms of how he decided to be to show his concern and generosity to separate that among the civil rights movement. The Nobel Prize speech that he made is a classic, because I think that's where he painted his world vision that began taking root in terms of what his final vision was for the Poor People's Campaign and for a global kind of focus on the human rights movement beyond it being a civil rights movement, that it was a human rights movement because we all lived in what he called the world house.
Oh, okay. Now, as a student under Dr. King, did you get into the civil rights movement?
Yes, and it was primarily in high school when the Atlanta student movement started around 1960 through 61, and I was in the 11th grade, and they were kind of calling for students to participate in the boycott, the sit-ins at Richards, which was a downtown department store. And a friend of mine and I, we participated in that, and that was our first exposure to that, to the civil rights movement. Fortunately, we didn't have to go to jail during that time. One of the most frightening moments for me, really during that time, when I was at Morehouse, was when on the way back from a job that I had as a janitorial worker, my dad and I had a janitorial business, and I was assigned to go to clean up a place that was in Stone Mountain, Georgia. And I went there, took care of that. About 1 o'clock in the morning, was coming back home. And somebody had asked me one time when I felt the closest to death, and this was that experience, because a police officer, a state trooper, pulled up behind me, and I knew I had not done anything that would get his attention, like speeding.
Yes.
I just happened to have a red Dodge Dart, which you would have no idea what that is. But
I can imagine what it looks like, but that's before
Had a
my
red
time.
Dodge.
Yeah.
Apparently, there was something about that really attracted his attention. So he pulled up behind me. Lights went on, and after he stopped me, I got out the car because you could do that then. I got out the car and asked him, why was I being stopped? And he said, as he took out his flashlight and hit me in the hand with such force that it almost broke some fingers. He said, "Nigga, I don't have to have a reason to stop you." It just so happened, though, as he put me back in the car and went to check out what the records and all of that on my license and all that. Just so happened he found out that my insurance had been expired. And he said, "You're going to have to leave your car here. I'm going to take you to jail. Get in the car." Now, during those days, there have been times when black males would be put in cars of state troopers and never heard from again. And I was very much aware of that as I was in the car of a state trooper who said he was taking me to jail, hoping that that would be where I wound up. And I can tell you, I was never so glad that I arrived at a jail in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which at that time was Ku Klux Klan territory, headquarters. It was kind of birthed out of Stone Mountain. And so I was glad to be arriving at a jail because it was something that relieved me that it had not had a more tragic ending. It was similar to the kind of situation that Dr. King was in when he participated in the student movement in Atlanta and got arrested. And he was taken to a prison in South Georgia, and he had talked about how he had really felt the threat of death in that, and was locked up, and that was during the time that Kennedy was running for president.
Okay.
And someone advised Kennedy to call the wife of Dr. King to give some assurance of his concern and some assurance of his safety as far as it being something that was well known, and hoping that I would give some assurance to him. Well, Kennedy was in a very tight race with Nixon, as you know. And a lot of folks said that call was the one that helped Kennedy to get the margin of victory that he needed, because Daddy King, for example, came home, and Daddy King at that time was a Republican.
Really?
Oh yeah. See, that's a whole other story in terms of how the Republican Party in the South was seen to be a kind of a liberal leverage, because the Dixiecrats, who were mostly Democrats, Russell and Talmadge, who were the senators from Georgia that went to Congress, they were very much against any civil rights legislation. And so the Republican Party, as the party of Lincoln, really got a lot of leverage among black citizens in Atlanta. And so he switched parties when he heard about what Kennedy had done, and told the folk at Ebenezer and went out over the airway that Kennedy was the one that he was voting for, and he was carrying a whole bunch of folks votes to Kennedy.
Right.
And other preachers, kind of joined into that chorus, and that's what many say was a margin.
Yes.
That was the victory for Kennedy that brought him into office over Kennedy, over Nixon. So it was a similar situation where he was terrified, and I was terrified, because in those days, when you got in the back of a state trooper's car, you may or may not wind up in jail. You may wind up dead.
Okay. Now, as mentioned, you were under the tutelage of Dr. King. What was it like being in the ministry with Dr. King?
Well, he was more of a mentor in terms of the time that he had to spend with us. And like there were several associate ministers in Ebenezer. One that preceded me was Reverend Albert Brinson was an associate at Ebenezer. And so it came my time after I received the call to ministry in 1967 to become a part of that. So I had the opportunity of hearing him as a preacher and sometimes being in on how he handled the pastoral aspect, even though as a co-pastor, he did not have the burden of that responsibility. Daddy King was still there. And so he basically came to Ebenezer because he had moved SCLC to Atlanta as its headquarters after the Montgomery protest. And the Masonic building, which is right down the street from Ebenezer, was where they set up the office.
Yes.
And Ebenezer was on that strip of Auburn Avenue, which was very self-sufficient. So part of what I saw mostly was him in the role as co-pastor and administrator at SCLC was something that I saw part of, but I primarily knew him in the pastoral capacity and marveled at his preaching. It was interesting when I recall now that he never recruited any members from the church into the movement, and particularly the youth into the movement, because I think that in his pastoral role, he was thinking that if anyone got hurt, that would be a hard price to pay to explain that, to their parents, to the membership, or anyone like that. So he really didn't recruit us to become a part of the movement where he knew that there was imminent danger.
And he wants you to do God's work.
Yeah. He really was focused more on that as far as how he saw his contribution and his tutelage leading us in that direction.
I do have a list of questions, and one just popped up in my head. One dark moment. The incident where the lady stabbed Dr. King.
Mm-hmm.
Explain what happened there.
Yeah, that's a real mystery in terms of her motive.
Yes.
And that's why it's basically said that she was a deranged person who, as you know, deranged folk take out big figures, major personalities or celebrities, just for whatever fulfillment that gets for them in terms of notoriety.
Yeah.
So this basically was one that was evidence of that kind of deranged person looking for notoriety, because there was no hate motive, or it wasn't like she was on assignment from anybody to do that. But that's just been the best arrangement. And then how he handled it, I think, was very healing for those that were concerned about her and him, because he never brought any prosecution against her. He never said any ill will, ill words about her. He kind of accepted that. And I remember how that blade was sticking out of his chest as the nurse was attending to him. And he was looking down as though he was as calm and as collected as you would ever see. And that was just amazing to see his response to that stabbing. But the reason for the stabbing still remains etched in mystery.
Yeah, because I've seen like movies and I've heard stories about that, and where she was, and of course it was a reenactment,
Right.
where she was real calm and in conversation with Dr. King, and then all of a sudden, at the blink of an eye, here comes the knife.
Yeah.
So again, it was very interesting to me, and her motive. If she was put up to, well, again, maybe she was deranged, like you said. So again, that was very tragic.
Right.
That particular day.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I want to add to that, though, I think that part of the reason for his calmness is that he had already accepted and had overcome the fear of death. And he often talks about that in the book Stride Toward Freedom, when when one night he really felt very vulnerable in terms of being drawn into the movement. He didn't volunteer, he was drafted. You know, the movement was going on, you know, when he arrived in Montgomery. And the reason that he was chosen was because he had just gotten there. And a lot of the city fathers didn't have anything on him, as they had manipulated or could manipulate other leaders in the community. And so by him being fresh on the scene, you know, he was able to move into that position as he was elected. But he was reluctant to do that. So at one point, when the weight of that came on him, was late night. He couldn't sleep. He got up, went into the kitchen to have a cup of coffee, and the report is that he started praying out loud. No, Lord, I'm afraid. These people have confidence in me, but I'm not sure if I can reward that confidence by way of being the kind of leader that they really want. So he really came to terms with his vulnerability in that moment. And that's when he said, that's when he heard a voice telling him, Martin Luther King Jr., stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I'll be with you all the way. He had a very personal kind of relationship that really had been the basis of his PhD, where he talked about the personalism of Henry Nelson Wyman as over against the theology of Paul Tillich. So he had already posited a very personal relationship with God intellectually. And this kind of stuff came down to the moment of vulnerability. And when he heard that kind of response, then that's when he felt like he had gotten a new charge. And it was fortunate that that happened then, because it was a few days later that his house was bombed. So after having that kind of assurance and that kind of confidence based on his relationship with God, he was not afraid of anything else that he would meet. And therefore, even at that stabbing, when he had that kind of calm, and even at the time of his death, those around him reported that there was no quiver, there was no sense of it being something unexpected. He had expected to die before he was the age of 40, and he was killed at 39. Yeah. So it had been a long road that had begun in Montgomery at that point of vulnerability that gave him the strength and the calm to face all kinds of storms and conflicts. And it was just amazing how he was able to do that.
On good days, when he was in civil rights mode, what would be considered a good day for him?
Well, he did spend time with the family, obviously, and there are pictures of him with his children, and one or two playing ball with his with his youngest son, Marty. So it's hard to identify what would have been a normal day, because most days were not very normal. You know, he was always on the road. Right. Almost 285 speeches a year, and that kind of thing. And in addition to the work that he was doing at Ebenezer as a co-pastor, so many days were not, very very normal for him. I think one of the things that I remember best, as far as what happened on a Sunday that was kind of normal, was that he came over to my mother and dad's house. They had just built a new house in a part of Atlanta that was much different than where I grew up, and invited Dr. King over with his mother and father and some other folk, you know. And I remember that one because when we were just kind of talking in the living room, he slumped down in the chair, and my mother took a picture of that, you know, as though to say, I'm really relaxed here. You know, so that was certain times when he was in company where he felt that he could relax, and he slouched a little bit, you know. And I found that to be kind of interesting because
Right.
you expected him to always be
Sitting upright.
Yeah, sitting upright.
Oh, like what we're doing now, like this.
Yeah. But he had on a informal shirt that day. Didn't come over with a suit and like anything that you would expect him to be in. So stepping out of that role gave me a kind of a signal of what it looked like for when he had kind of a normal day. But many of those were very rare. Very
Yes.
rare.
I have a dream. Probably the most memorable speech ever. Tell me about that speech. There's a little story behind that speech that you know.
Yeah.
Please tell me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been reported before, but the "I Have a Dream" speech ending was not what he had on script because it had been used so many times before. Dr. Walker was one of those who told me that he tried to encourage Martin, as he called him. He said, "Don't use that speech because we've heard it so many times. You need to have another ending to the speech for the March on Washington." And he had crafted one that he was going to end with. But as he got on toward the ending, Mahalia Jackson, a very well-known gospel singer.
My mother loves her.
Yes. She was from Detroit. And Doc had done a march on Detroit before the March on Washington, and he had given a speech there in which he ended it with the "I Have a Dream" speech in Detroit. She was there, and therefore she saw that he was coming to the end of this speech on the March on Washington, and she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And that's when he shifted from what he had written out as to be the ending into the "I Have a Dream" speech by the urging of the Spirit and the words from encouragement from Mahalia Jackson,
Yes.
who had heard that speech and felt like that was a more appropriate ending. So tell them about the dream, Martin.
Yes.
Tell them about the dream. That's the story.
You know, they say that over 250,000 people attended that march.
Right.
And again, I still remember the images like yesterday, and I just imagined myself being there and what it was like.
Oh, yeah, I was there.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I was about 500 feet from the podium
Okay.
in order to see him. So it was, and even the interesting part about even getting there was something kind of significant because Albert Brinson, who was an associate at Ebenezer, and I drove up to Washington to the march. We drove by way of Lynchburg,
Virginia. Okay.
Got there about 12 o'clock at night and knew that there was nowhere that we were going to be able to stay, but we just kind of rested a little bit in Lynchburg. Well, when we drove through Lynchburg, downtown Lynchburg had a noose in the heart of town because several cars and travelers were coming that way.
Okay.
And they wanted to send a signal by way of hanging that noose in Lynchburg, which had a legacy of lynching already because that's why they called
Right.
it Lynchburg. And so we saw the noose and we got the message, you know, don't stop here. Don't even think about stopping here. Keep on moving. But that was what a lot of people engaged as they were on the way to that March on Washington. And why it was such a magnificent representation of all aspects of the movement at that time, even those that had been a little in opposition of King, civil disobedience and the way that he went about, because the president of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, executive director of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, and some others who had had more traditional approaches felt like the campaign of mass marching and civil disobedience was going to be more disruptive. But they came on board, and
Okay.
they were on the first lines of that march. So it was a major moment, and that speech fit the moment.
Dr. King's right-hand man, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. How instrumental was he in the civil rights movement with Dr. King?
Well, that goes back to Montgomery because he and Dr. King became friends when he came to Montgomery. And even before he was president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, before MIA, I'm sorry, Dr. Abernathy had been instrumental in establishing that organization right after Rosa Parks was arrested. And I got to say this a little bit. A lot of folks don't recognize that the reason that Rosa Parks would not get up was not because her feet were tied. It was because of what she remembered that the mother of Emmett Till did when he was killed, and because he had supposedly whistled at a white girl because he was from Chicago, and he came down south, small town, Money, Mississippi, where he was sitting in this place and started talking with his buddy about this white girl, and said something that sounded offensive to those whites who were around him, white men who were around him. Next thing you know, he's taken off, beaten, pins stuck, I mean, not pins, but like a fence wire around his neck, shot in his head. And his body was brought back to be for the funeral in Chicago. His mother said, "I do not want this to be a closed casket. I want the world to see what they have done to my boy." And that went out over Jet, put the picture of the casket
On the front cover?
on the front cover. It went out all over the nation, all over the world. And that really kind of started the movement because Rosa Parks said that the reason she didn't get up was because she remembered what the mother of Emmett Till did. And that was the inspiration for her keeping her seat. And that was the instant that really started, the movement. And a lot of folks don't make that connection, in terms of why Rosa Parks didn't get up, and in terms of how that generated the momentum for the Montgomery protest.
And rumor has it that the trial, the jury went to deliberation for like an hour, and they came back and they said that we would have came back a little bit sooner. We went out to go get a Coke.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That trial and the expressions that you can see in the documentary Eye on the Prize of how those two white men and everybody knew they were guilty, but because they were able to get away with it, I mean, it was kind of like a point of celebration. And that became a constant source of irritation as far as why this had been something so callously presented in the press and in the nation, and that was what aroused her to take that stand.
Okay. The letters from the Birmingham jail. What was his inspiration for writing it?
It was a response to ministers who had written him, trying to encourage him to consider that the real Christian movement or the real Christian way was not to start being aggressive that would be disruptive in a community, but to be more kind in terms of the compassionate spirit of Jesus. And so they presented this argument in terms of how he was really going against the basic principles of the Christian faith, and that he should not be such an agitator, but more of a moderator, for change. Okay. And what it was doing to the city, etc. So they presented some very interesting and philosophical kind arguments for their position, and he felt like that it was upon him to answer it. And so he just began scrapping on whatever was available, this letter. In fact, Wyatt Walker had helped him to craft the letter that he was sending, as they were sitting in jail in 1963. And so it was a response to so-called moderate clergy at a time in Birmingham that they thought that they were really taking a more moderate position, and was recommending that this would be a more Christian way of handling it. And so he responded by giving all the reasons why it was not, and why this was the time, for that we can't wait. We can't wait. We can't be moderate. This is the time of what he would often call the German time, the zeitgeist. This is the moment.
Okay.
This is the moment that has to be seized. And he gave all the reasons for it being that moment that had to be seized.
J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. It gets interesting. We're going to ramp it up now.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
J. Edgar Hoover's intention, his assignment really had been given him by Robert Kennedy. And the whole notion was that just in case there were communist influences, conversations that King was having, with enemies of the state, so to speak, that he wanted to know about it, So that was the reason for the phone tapping being authorized by Robert Kennedy, that gave J. Edgar Hoover access to do the phone tapping. And then when Hoover found out that that was not what he was doing, there were some associates that had been members of the Communist Party, or who shared that kind of allegiance, not to the party, but to the principles, of the party, which civil disobedience was one of the things, mass movement, orientation, and philosophy. So Hoover was really looking to see whether that was infiltrating the movement. When he heard some other things that were of another ilk, he kind of shifted then, because he also had been infiltrating the conversations of Malcolm X for the same purpose. But because Malcolm was of a different mode of man, so to speak, he didn't find very much there. But he kept harassing King. And the harassment really brought about some disturbing moments in his personal life, as well as his public life. So Hoover was on a mission to destroy him, and using any means necessary, to do that. And unfortunately, that's when the FBI was in allegiance with the White House, which kind of raises interesting questions in terms of what's happening now.
Right.
But that was the direction that inspired Hoover to tap King's phone. And they became aware of it. King associates, they became aware of it much later. But yeah, so the FBI, by way of J. Edgar Hoover, became a chief nemesis of King. But King never responded to the nemesis directly. He just knew that was a part of the price that he would have to pay for the escalation of the movement as he saw it, going just from beyond civil rights to human rights, and human rights engaging the issues of racism, the evils of racism, militarism, and poverty.
Yes.
But so that was how that nemesis, developed. And I admire James Comey, because he would always take graduates of the FBI Academy by the monument to King in D.C. Not because it was an effort to give them, leverage for adoration and all that, but because it reminded him of how there needs to be a separation of powers between the FBI, the White House, and how they can use each other as it was done during the time of Martin Luther King Jr.'s time, that he had to endure that intimidation from the FBI.
You mentioned earlier about Dr. King's biggest nemesis, not so much as far as J. Edgar Hoover, but because he was carrying out the orders. But you mentioned Kennedy. Why?
Well,
what was Kennedy's angle?
Yeah, the only thing I thought that Kennedy felt he had to do was to protect the White House, protect his brother, in terms of what kind of conspiracy might be undermining the safety of the United States as a result of allegiance within the United States for overturning certain facets of government or interrupting the flow of government and that kind of thing. That's the only thing that really has surfaced, because in another sense he was very supportive of the civil rights struggle, and the Kennedy King connection was kind of like off and on. Like before the march, it was very antagonistic. After the march, Kennedy started shifting some of his principles in favor of the movement. He just didn't have the time to put together the legislation before he was killed. But that legacy was passed on to Lyndon Johnson, who, as a Southerner, was in a very unique position of shifting some legislation, and did that in 1964 and 65.
Selma, March, Bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Yeah.
I recall watching the movie Selma, and of course, any movie that kind of depicts history, for some odd reason, it kind of slants to truth a little bit. This has a history of doing that. But on this particular occasion here with Dr. King, I remember the scene where the first time they was going to march across that bridge, that they took a knee. They knelt down, kind of like a surrender, or we're going to retreat. We're not going to do this.
Well, no, the first time they went across that bridge, they were beaten, because that's when John Lewis was at the head of the line. And
Congress, you're a senator.
Oh yeah.
John Lewis.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Talk about John Lewis.
Yeah, John Lewis was one of the most fascinating, and I think he still hasn't been given his due, and is likely to get it, after he passes away, or so to speak. But John Lewis was a interesting transitional figure. He was a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which came into development as the student movement, started in terms of the freedom rides that took place in the South, and the students, boycott in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the student movement kind of evolved. And it was not initially a part of SCLC, except by the connection that one of the members of the SCLC's board, that King asked to kind of help with bringing some connection between the student movement and SCLC. But, and the student movement was very aggressive. It wasn't just about civil rights. It was about, the kind of strategies that they use going down south, and bringing attention to buses being on fire and that kind of thing. So John Lewis was a part of that, but he was also kind of like a bridge to the nonviolent strategy that King had embraced. So he always kept that, even though some of his colleagues, in SNCC like Stokely Carmichael, embraced it as a tactic at first, but did not see that as being something that he thought was going to yield the kind of results that would be liberating, you know. But John Lewis stayed with the philosophy and was committed to the philosophy of nonviolence, and therefore he stands out in my mind as being one of the strongest leaders that was able to kind of engage the transition between the formal structure of SCLC, but the movement of the students and their more aggressive way of dealing with some of the things that they were fighting for. And he was very faithful to that. And then his transition into Congress was a whole another story, a whole nother battle that he was able to overcome.
Moving to April 3rd, 1968. His last speech before that dreadful day. Talk to me about that. Again, it's very moving. What are your thoughts on that particular day? What like to his last speech?
Yeah, the last speech engaged something similar to the I Have a Dream speech in terms of it being a moment of inspiration, but it came out of a different place. That was one of the most, that was one of the darkest moments in the civil rights movement, and also for him personally, because of the stand that he had taken against the war in Vietnam, because of the stand that he had taken for the Poor People's Campaign, and because of the strategies that he was talking about using that would unite poor whites and blacks, and that kind of thing had not been even attempted to since the populist revolt after the Civil War under Tom Watson. So that was a total different conflict, and also it was at the lowest place for him personally, because some of the alienation really registered on him in such a way that it really caused for some serious bout with depression, etc. But in spite of all that, and physically he was ill because on the plane ride, he caught a cold. And so he was resting in the hotel and told Ralph to go over for this rally in support of the sanitation workers. Ralph got over there and saw that they were looking for him. They were looking for him, and so he called back to the hotel and said, "Doc, I know you're not feeling up to it, but this is your crowd. These folk will not let anybody speak where you are supposed to be in this moment." And so King got up and got dressed and drove on over there. And it was one of those moments when you look at the film of the speech, and the thing that I noticed most about that film, that footage, is that it had an angle on his face that you won't see anywhere else, because it was almost like the angle was at the left side.
Yeah.
And that was going to be the place where he would be shot the next day with a single bullet. But it had an angle on him where you saw in his face a different kind of agony on one side and ecstasy for the moment on the other side.
Right. Now, but he got shot on the right side?
No, I'm sorry, the left side. I think the bullet came in the left side of his neck.
Okay.
Yeah. But the angle was so close that you could see the intensity in his face. That's basically what I'm saying.
Okay.
And how that intensity registered so powerfully, in that moment, unlike anything else I had really ever seen. And it really showed the agony and the ecstasy that he was experiencing about knowing that this was likely to be the place and the time when he would be killed. But he was not scheduled to speak. He was scheduled to speak, but he had wanted to stay, and Ralph called him and said, no, you got to be here. So it was like history about the providence of God. He made that speech on April 3rd, and that was the last speech before he was killed. And that's why it stands out for me, and I think for a whole lot of folk, as far as it being one of King's most majestic moments in a time where he was almost like at his lowest ebb. And you can see at the end of the speech, he was exhausted. You know, Jesse had to hold him, and Ralph, you know, they had to hold him up because he was exhausted, he was spent. But what he had said.
Yeah, I remember when his part, he says, I've seen the, my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Yeah.
And at that point, as he turned away, noticed a few guys in the back, came to him, I guess, in assistance.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, again, it was kind of dark in the background, but again, like you said, they was helping him because of his condition.
Oh, yeah. He really didn't finish the phrase because he was really going into the verses of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Yes.
He's trampling out the vintage where the grace of wrath was sword. He had used that a whole lot of times. But all he got out that night was, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And then he really ran out, almost like out of breath, and just kind of dropped. Mm-hmm. And that's when they helped him to his seat.
It's almost like his last speech, as you mentioned earlier, that he knew that this was going to be it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost like, to me, it's almost like saying like he somewhat preached his own eulogy.
Oh yeah, I, as a preacher, I would say it was like his last speech was scripted by the Eternal, because it was in the right moment, for the right cause, in the right place where he was unexpected, but by the providence of God, placed in that space because it would be his last message in that moment.
Yes. April 4th.
Yeah.
Would probably go down as the darkest day in American history. The Lorraine Motel.
Yeah.
Describe that scene in your eyes.
I did not go to the Lorraine Motel until 2 weeks after Doc's death at his funeral at Ebenezer. His sister called me and asked that I would give the prayer at the funeral, and I gave the prayer at the funeral of Dr. King. But I did not go to Lorraine Motel until maybe about a couple of weeks later, because then I just kind of wanted to see what it felt like being in the place where he had spent his last night. Mm-hmm. And went in there, and it was really what you would call a two-star hotel at best. And it had its day, but it was just so simple. And so just kind of walking in there and seeing the bed where he had slept, and you can't get in there now, but I was glad that I went then. And so it just kind of gave a sense of presence in that place where he had spent his last night. And then walking out on the balcony where he had been killed was just bringing it closer in a sense of what that moment felt like, for him and for those that were there around him. But I couldn't go immediately, but I did go a couple of weeks later, and I'm glad I did that, because now you can't really get in the room. I mean, you can see it,
right,
but you can't walk into it. But I had the opportunity of going into the room and seeing the bed where he slept.
Yeah, 2 years ago, I went to Memphis. I stopped at Memphis and went to the scene, and remembering all of the pictures, the images of how he was killed. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, as I'm standing there on the ground in the parking lot, I'm looking around and I'm noticing, okay, how did the bullet travel? You know, which
Yeah.
angle and
Yeah.
what have you. Looking at it today, I mean, the whole landscape around it was so totally different because again, it's like on a hillside and you have I mean, it's a tourist attraction now.
Right.
So, but to actually replay in your mind, just think, okay, how did this happen? Again, it was kind of like a eerie feeling, just to say, okay,
Oh yeah.
here is the place where the most influential person in history, so they say next to Gandhi, the most influential person was killed here. And I somewhat got to witness the quote unquote crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
On April 1st, 2008, there was an article in Atlanta Magazine describing the funeral of Dr. King.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned earlier, you know, the scene and everything. You were interviewed in the magazine. Do you have anything else to kind of add to that? Anything different as far as your take on? Because we all know that, you know, the 60s was the most, in my book, the most controversial decade in history because, again, King was killed in 68. Malcolm X was killed, I believe, in 65, because I could be wrong.
Right.
And then you have on 11/22/63, JFK.
Mm-hmm.
And then Robert Kennedy died, I believe, in the same year, 68.
Oh, yeah.
Later that year after King, because I remember a scene where Robert Kennedy was at a rally and he basically, more like breaking news, just want to let you know that King was shot and killed. Mm-hmm. I remember that. And those four prominent figures in the civil rights movement were killed. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was a sense of controversy surrounding it. Mm-hmm. So, you know, again, what else can you tell me about this particular, this grim scene that just, you know,
Yeah.
just moved you?
A couple of things come to mind. I led the ministers off the podium as they were bringing the body up the aisle, and I noticed and I looked and saw that both Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were there, as well as many other celebrities and that kind of thing. And before I met Hubert Humphrey, who would come represent the president. But what most significant about that was not so much the day, but after a long while, the suspicion that James Earl Ray was not the lone assassin was confirmed by the family itself. Martin Luther King III, Dexter, kid, and the wife, Coretta. Yeah, they felt, they had always felt, and many of the folks felt, and I was convinced that was no way that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin, because even the position of the bullet, and remember Kennedy had 3 bullets that may have come from different directions, and they still, kind of dealing with that whole conspiracy theory. But this one was one bullet aimed at his neck, almost like if, in fact, he was able to survive, he wouldn't be able to speak, wouldn't be able to talk, but it was aimed at his neck. Single shot. That's a highly skilled assassin. And James Earl Ray did not have anything in his background that suggested that he was that kind of highly skilled marksman. So I do believe, and a whole lot of folk believe, and it was like the King family finally came around to admitting their own distrust of the notion that it was the work of a single assassin, which means that it was a part of a larger conspiracy against the notion of what King was doing or anticipating to do, as far as calling for a economic redistribution of wealth, that was what got him killed. You know, King was not killed because he was a civil rights leader. He was killed because of the plan and the proposal for a massive movement that included poor whites, blacks, and that was really going up against the state as a political war machine, as well as the economic injustice. And that just couldn't, that could not survive. I mean, he could not survive with that kind of confrontation or plan, against the state. And so there was no doubt that it was more than just James Earl Ray. And how that's handled, more currently. The conspiracy theory behind Kennedy is much more intriguing, seemingly, in terms of what happened there but everybody that was close to him or even acquainted with what he was intending and the Poor People's Campaign knew that that was what got him killed.
Reverend English, describe the history between LBJ and Dr. King. How was it a love-hate thing?
Not on Dr. King's part, because one of the things that fascinates anybody who was associated with Dr. King, he did not make enemies by his intention. He was always responding to the enemies who made him, so to speak, who would come after him. But he did not. So it was a kind of a situation where Dr. King applauded the fact that this Southern senator, from Texas, would become the harbinger of civil rights legislation in the way that he went about it. Mm-hmm. Kennedy would have been expected to do that, but not Johnson. Just that shift alone, mm-hmm. and the kind of conversations that they had in the White House, and the kind of pictures that you see really show kind of a mutual admiration until he made his stance against the war in Vietnam. That's when it turned adversarial. That's when King was no longer invited to the White House for conferences or for talks or for trying to work out something, because he had gone up against the president's authorization of the war in Vietnam, mm-hmm. and that kind of thing. So that's when it turned adversarial, but it didn't turn adversarial on King's part. It became adversarial on Johnson's part, because King still wanted to talk, but he had changed the agenda. And this agenda was much unfriendlier than the one that he had learned to embrace before. So that was part of the. So when you talk about it being a love-hate relationship, I wouldn't put it in terms of how King saw it, but possibly in terms of how Johnson saw it, because a friend that he had thought that he had made in terms of what he had done became an adversary that became an estranged arrangement, between them, rather than one that was as friendly as it had been when he was supportive of the movement.
Okay. Reverend English, on January 24th, 1960, Dr. King came to First Baptist Church here in Charleston, West Virginia, and Reverend Moses Newsom was the pastor. Mm-hmm. And he spoke. How did the city of Charleston receive Dr. King?
Well, that was a time when he was at his zenith, so I'm sure the city was very appreciative of his presence as much as they could demonstrate. And I really don't have a lot of information about how the city received him, but from the records at the church and even from the recording that I heard of the speech that he gave, or the sermon that he gave that day, was three dimensions of a complete life, based on the passage in Revelation where the city of God, was equal on all sides, depth, breadth, and width. So, and that happened to have been the first sermon that he had preached at Dexter when he was called there.
Okay.
So it got. But one thing I remember about listening to it was that it was kind of silent, in terms of how the response to him was in that kind of situation. But he came on the anniversary, 100th anniversary of First Baptist Church, when Reverend Moses Newsom was there, and that's where I was called to in 1972. And it has a very significant legacy, that they are really celebrating this year, 150th anniversary of the church. So part of what happened when he came was in response to what happened everywhere he went. But the interesting thing was that it was First Baptist Charleston, West Virginia, where he was coming in response to a church invitation, and not to really bring a civil rights speech as such, but in response to what he appreciated about the history of the church, because he knew that his predecessor at Dexter, Dr. Vernon Johns, went to Dexter from First Baptist Charleston. And therefore, that was a kind of a tie-in already, with the legacy of First Baptist Church. And Vernon Johns and King responding to the invitation to come from Moses Newsom in the 100th anniversary of the church's celebration.
And you have ties to the church as well, correct?
Oh, yeah. That's what I was saying. I came here to pastor First Baptist in 1972.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the most memorable thing Dr. King has ever told you? Words of wisdom.
Yeah, the phrase that came, words of wisdom that spoke volumes to me, was a quote that he often used. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that phrase over and over, just kind of comes, shows up, not just as a word of personal advice in terms of how you face adversarial situations, but you can trust that the part of a larger movement in history, a larger movement even in your life, is leaning toward justice, is leaning towards something that says that the universe is friendly. One of the quotes that Vernon Johns often said, that he said that if a philosopher was asked, what is the most fundamental question that you would want to ask of the universe? And the philosopher responded, I would want to know, is the universe friendly? So when you assume that the universe is friendly, it kind of gives you a feeling that that is a moral center in the universe that will reward every effort that moves toward that moral center.
Okay.
And therefore it's a word of encouragement. So even though that was a phrase that he used over and over again, that's one that kind of lives with me personally, as far as knowing that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
2018. Again, we are talking about the 50th anniversary. President Trump. Right now, of course, there's a little bit of turmoil, with race relations. And then we think about the I Have a Dream speech. How much have this nation regressed from his dream speech? Do you think we've gone back into time, kind of reversed the time and going back to those dark days of racism? Or do you think that we have progressed from it? Have we gained from it? And is the pinnacle of the speech when Barack Obama was elected president, in your words?
I think that my response to that is a very definite kind of ambivalence, because I remember being interviewed many times with that question, and it would often come up in national media as well. And that was that after King's holiday was established, everybody would always use the question, how far do you think we have come toward realizing Dr. King's dream? And then, you can kind of get the report of how far we've come in terms of legislation, how far we've come in terms of the country receiving the benefits of what came out of the civil rights movement. But that question, when it's put in a larger platform, you begin seeing that no, not quite. Mm-hmm. Because the larger scale and the larger frame of the question as it is presented now would show that the hatred and the lack of a moral center being a part of what is happening now is what's showing up as almost as if the dream had been bankrupt.
Okay.
All right? And that's why I admire the movement that is developing of the rehearsal of the Poor People's Campaign in terms of what is being planned to redress those same kind of grievances, but not just by a single march, but by marches in communities that are addressing different aspects of what is needed in terms of economic justice, in terms of environmental justice, and in terms of those kind of issues that are peculiar to communities that also are part of a wider area of protest. But the most thing that I enjoy, I really relish about Dr. Barber is that he is trying to restore the moral center of nonviolence as a part of that movement. And nonviolence means that you are at least trying to make a connection, or that you are trying to establish relationships, rather than discordance by way of identifying the face of the enemy. He's identifying the face of the enemy, but he's not doing it in such a way, and similar to what King did, he was not doing it in such a way that you hate the face of an enemy, but that you recognize what the enemy is doing,
right.
But you don't hate the enemy. You are trying to deal with things that are causing the enemy to think the way he is thinking, and the perceptions that he has, and the prejudices that are inbuilt on what we have been awakened to in this period of reactions.
Last question. What would you tell today's youth
in terms of
how
who and
yes, what should be their purpose as far as, well, of course, get education ultimately.
Oh yeah.
But things like about the dream, race relations, because again, in the school system, all they talk about is Dr. King and I have a dream, and that is it. What would you tell today's youth about what they can do in reference to the dream speech, as far as how can they carry that torch into their adulthood and pass it on down? Because again, sitting here with you, I'm learning a whole lot, and we've talked about this before, and again, I'm like a kid right now, just enjoying the conversation with you about this right here. We did this before, and I'm enjoying it right now because I'm learning a whole lot as far as what took place through your eyes, through your experience. But what can you share with the youth, like teenagers? What can they gain from it, and what can they do to make it so much easier on their life? What can they do?
Yeah. Well, I have served as and still do, substitute teaching in the Lamar County school system at all levels. And I do that in order to kind of keep in touch with what's happening in the school system, what's happening in education, and whatnot. And one of the things that present concern is how their inner light for change has not been nourished. And Dr. King always talked about how the torch of freedom has to burn inside before it can lead to actions that would change the course of history outside. So that torch and that inner light is something that the educational system is still struggling to ignite, because there are other influences and there are other pressures and that kind of thing. And then there's the notion that if you are not of a certain attitude or temperament, that you wind up in the prison, in the pipeline from school to prison, particularly as black males are concerned. And
Yes.
that's really a serious issue that has really surfaced in terms of how slavery by another name has amassed such attention, because it really starts putting brown and black males into the school to prison pipeline early because of certain perceptions that are brought to them based on how teachers have been educated or have been taught about them, and particularly in a situation where they're in a minority. Now, one thing I got to say about the recent protests of teachers in Charleston, there were like 200,000 folk showing up here, is that they never put the face of the enemy on the legislature. In the sense of arousing hatred toward them. They were standing for something rather than against something. And part of what we are struggling with now is how to teach ourselves and our children how to stand for something, not just against something. And and that takes more work, because it really takes something, where you're doing constant spiritual, intellectual inventory about what are you standing for.
Right.
And one of the mentors of King was Dr. Howard Thurman, and that was one of the constant points and push and emphasis that he would often say, what are you standing for? What is your grain in the wood, that he would describe it, that really establishes who you are and what you learn from the inside in terms of how you deal with that. Because if you're clear about that, and you're clear about the path that you want to go on, then other things will be, you will be energized to deal with other obstructions,
Yes.
other oppressions, and systematic ways that have redefined you in another way, if you know what. So that's where I see, and I know that's a kind of a fuzzy answer to the question that you asked, but it's not something that you can really program on a script.
Right.
As such, along that line. It's something that has to reshape the writing of the script in terms of how we help our children to see who they are and appreciate who they are and what their inner light is that will light their way in the world.
Yeah. Reverend English, I want to thank you. Thank you for making this happen.
Thank you.
Again, I look forward to talking more with you about this right here. And again, I love this segment right here. And I hope that, and I know that hearts will change, minds will be made up, and positive things will come out of this. So again, I want to thank you.
So.
Thank you very much for sitting down and talking with me on this right here.
I think when it is darkest, we can see the light.
All right.
We can see the stars.
Thank you very much for tuning in and watching the show. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Again, my name is Ray Whiting, and again, this is King, Remembering the Legacy. Have a good day.